Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Vidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhutaguhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Very good. Welcome back. We're starting today. Verse 14. In fact, I think we'll finish the chapter today. Not too much left. Chapter 12, as you remember, is called Prakasha Prakaranam. Prakasha means light, but the subject of the subject of the chapter seems to be mostly focused on false identification, which is such an important topic. And I think in the concluding verses here today, you'll see why that problem of false identification is such a problem. Adhyasa, superimposition, central teaching of Shankara's Advaita. Before we see this, there's a question. And the question was after last class, we talked about the knower of the knower, and we're going to return to that today. The questioner says, my problem is not that there is a knower of the knower. My problem is, how did the knower originate? So far, I have not found a satisfactory answer to that. How did the knower originate? I believe this questioner understands that consciousness didn't originate. As you all know very well, uncreated, unchanging, eternal is consciousness, chaitanya or chit. But knower is not a synonym for consciousness. Knower refers to consciousness in a particular context. When consciousness, in fact, it's surprisingly complicated. There are actually two additional factors for consciousness to become a knower. And I'm sorry if this sounds a little bit involved. It actually is, and it's important for us to understand this properly. This is all working? Yes. So consciousness alone is not a knower. Consciousness is only a knower when it's associated with two things. What are those two things? One is mind, and the other is an object known. Make sense? Now look at this, and just to make it very clear, suppose there's consciousness without a mind, but with objects, like in deep sleep. In deep sleep, your mind undergoes dissolution. Your mind is not present. Consciousness is present. Your body is present. Your bed is present. Your house is present. Plenty of objects are present. Consciousness is present, and objects are present. But there's no knower in the absence of mind. The other instance would be, suppose there is consciousness plus mind and nothing to be known. What would be an example of that? Samadhi. In samadhi, the mind is present, consciousness is present, mind is present, but in a certain kind of samadhi, what Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra, he calls it asampragnata samadhi. In that particular kind of samadhi, there's no object present in the mind, no mental objects present. So in asampragnata samadhi, consciousness is present, mind is present, but there's no knower. There's no knower because to be a knower, there has to be something known, and in samadhi, there's nothing known. So, how does a knower originate? When the mind and an object known are available. That's how. the knower originates. Also in this next sequence of verses, we're going to see that same topic is discussed. Let's see those verses now. Nyataiva hama vigneyaha nyata amaham Nyataiva hama vigneyaha Nyataiva hama vigneyaha Shuddho mukta sadetyapi Shuddho mukta sadetyati Viveki pratyayo buddhir Viveki pratyayo buddhir Drishyatva nashavattvataha Drishyatva nashavattvataha Jnata eva aham avigneyaha. Aham, I am jnata eva, the knower alone, the knower who is avigneyaha, the knower who is not known. I am the unknown knower, the knower who is not known by anything else. This is a lovely, poetic way of referring to consciousness. Everything is known to the knower, but the knower is not known to anyone or anything else. We're seeing more references to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. That's what he's drawing upon here. The knower who is unknown, the knower who is not known to any other knower is Shuddhaha, pure in the sense of unaffected by the mind. We've had that discussion several times. Just like a crystal is unaffected by the color that might be present in it, consciousness is utterly unaffected by whatever is happening in your mind. And that consciousness is sada. You have to break apart the word sada, iti api. Sada, always muktaha, free, eternally free. As we've discussed, consciousness doesn't get enlightened. Consciousness doesn't need Vedanta. Consciousness doesn't need Swami Taratmananda to say anything at all. Consciousness has no problem. The problem is suffering, and suffering is a mental phenomenon. So the problem of suffering in the mind is addressed through the teachings of Vedanta. Now, here's an interesting observation. Who is speaking here in this verse? It's in the first person. Shankara composes this verse. Jnata eva aham. I am the knower. Avigneyaha, the knower who is unknown to any other knower. The one who is shuddhaha, unaffected by the problems of the body and mind. The one who is sada muktaha iti. The one who is eternally free, never trapped in samsara. Who is uttering those words? And again, it's a little more complex than it might look like on the surface. So consciousness doesn't have a mouth, right? Now we know that Shankara has used a rhetorical device of putting words in the mouth of consciousness, but let's interpret this verse in another way. Because someone who's enlightened could certainly say, Jnata eva aham. I am the knower. I am avigneyaha. My consciousness is not known by anything else. I am shuddhaha. The problems of my body and mind don't affect me. I am sada muktaha. The consciousness which is my essential nature, it was never trapped in a life of samsara. So one who is enlightened can certainly utter these words. So then, who is the I when an enlightened person utters these words? Who is the I that's uttering these words? Now here we have to be a little practical. Ahankara, ego. There's this common mistaken notion that the enlightened person has no ego, that the ego has been utterly destroyed for the enlightened person, which is why a few saints, I don't know if they're enlightened or not, have adopted this language. This is hungry. This came 1 hour ago. Now, there are several instances of that. I think we've had this discussion before. That kind of language is certainly peculiar and unnecessary. So why is it somehow impossible for an enlightened person to use the first person pronoun, I? That doesn't make, or is the enlightened person afraid of using the word I? Wait a minute, if you're enlightened, what do you have to be afraid of? Is just a pronoun? How can a pronoun hurt you or drag you out of enlightenment in any sense? So, an enlightened person indeed has an ahankara, an ego, but it's significantly different than yours. When somebody asks you, who are you? You have a long litany of things. This is my name, this is where I live, this is what I do for a living, blah, 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 blah. And when you ask an enlightened person, who are you really? The enlightened person will say, I'm sat-chit-ananda atma. Why not? If you ask me, what is your name? I'll tell you Swami Taratmananda. If you ask me, who are you really? I have no doubt. Sat-chit-ananda atma. So an enlightened person will use that language. I am sat-chit-ananda atma. That I is ego, ahankara. Remember, consciousness can't talk. So we make a distinction. My guru used this language, which was kind of thought-provoking. He called it an enlightened ego. Perfect. That's brilliant. There is an unenlightened ego, the one who says, I am male, female, young, old, happy, sad, etc., etc. Unenlightened ego. Then there's an enlightened ego that says, I am sat-chit-ananda atma. It's a matter of self-knowledge and self-definition. Self-knowledge means you know your name, you know your parents, you know your whole history, and if Vedanta has gone in, you also know that your true nature is sat-chit-ananda atma. That's self-knowledge. In addition to self-knowledge, there's such a thing as self-concept, self-identity, ego, ahankara. So the unenlightened ego says, I am male, female, etc., etc. The enlightened ego says, I am sat-chit-ananda atma. So that's the one speaking here. Notice it's a huge mistake. Just to go back to my opening comment about that, it's a huge mistake to imagine that the enlightened person is egoless, because ego is an organizing principle in our minds. Without that sense of being an I, and a person, an individual being, you can't function. Remember, I've given the example of when you're absorbed in music or some other activity, that ego undergoes dissolution, but as long as you're in that state of absorption, you can't do anything. We've had this in detail, we've discussed this before, so I won't go into it any further, except to reiterate, it is a huge error to assume that an enlightened person's ego has been destroyed. We could say that the ignorance that previously molded the ego has been destroyed, but not the ego. The ego has become enlightened. Okay, we'll continue now. Second half. Second half is actually more connected to the next verse than to the first half of this verse. So it's almost like we're starting something new here, where Shankara says, Viveki pratyaya buddhehe. The pratyaya here means a mental activity, a concept, and here let's call it knowledge, because I think that is the right interpretation here. Buddhehe pratyayaha, a vritti, as mental event. A vritti in the mind, buddhi, intellect, a vritti in the intellect in the form of knowledge is pratyayaha buddhehe. But what kind of knowledge? Viveki, a discerning knowledge. Knowledge that discerns your true nature. The particular knowledge in which your true nature as sat-chit-ananda is recognized. We call it jnana vritti, a vritti in the form of jnanam, or there's a fancy word, I won't explain all this, but the fancy word used in some Vedanta text is akhandakara vritti, a vritti whose form is akhanda, undivided, divisionless. We'll set that aside for now, but you should know that that's a term used for the vritti. To gain any knowledge, you need a thought. When you were a child, you were taught 2 + 2 is 4. Well, that was a thought that occurred in your mind. 2 + 2 is 4, which gave you knowledge that 2 + 2 is 4. Some time ago, you got the knowledge that Atma is sat-chit-ananda. So that knowledge takes place in the form of a vritti. But now here's the question. Vritti is a mental event. Mind, thoughts. Even jnana vritti, even knowledge of your true nature is a mental event. And one thing we know for sure is that mental events come and go. Which means when you discover, I am sat-chit-ananda Atma, that discovery, that vritti, that knowledge goes away. Tell me, when that vritti goes away, does enlightenment go away? Do you have to hold on to that vritti to be enlightened? Does the enlightened person spend all day long thinking, I am sat-chit-ananda, I am sat-chit-ananda, I am such? Because if that vritti goes away, enlightenment goes away. Silly, right? So, knowledge destroys ignorance. Then that jnana vritti, that thought in the form of knowledge goes away. And that's what he says in the last line. He says, nasyavattvataha. Because that vritti is nasyavatva, because of the impermanence. Literally the destructibility, but that's kind of a funny word. So we'll say the impermanence of that vritti. Drishyatvat, and that vritti is known to you, is seen by you. The vritti is something that arises in your mind. The vritti is something that goes away. That's true for all mental activities, including the mental activity that culminates in enlightenment, discovery of your true self, atma-jnana. That mental activity also comes and goes. The commentator refers to a famous example used by Shankara himself. This example comes in Atma-bodha, and it's about it's called Kataka Renu. If we lived in ancient times, there's a little problem of getting clean water, right? So suppose you have some water and you see the water is brown and cloudy. you might not be inclined to drink that brown, cloudy water. So apparently in ancient times there was a nut known as kataka. So they would take this kataka nut, grind it up into a powder, put some of that powder in the water, and apparently that powder would bind with the suspended particles in the water and then precipitate out. And in that way, it would clarify the water. So you put that kataka renu means dust, in the water, and it makes the impurities settle out. Very nice metaphor for the jnana vritti. Notice it settles out. And of course, you don't drink that part on the bottom of the cup. So the kataka nut does its job, and then it's over. It's done. After it's done its job, it's nothing more for it to do. It's removed in the same way. The jnana vritti, the thought in the form of self-knowledge, does its job. It removes ignorance, and then it goes away. Remember, you suffer because of ignorance, right? This is where we begin Vedanta. Due to ignorance, you identify with your body and mind. Due to that identification of the body and mind, your problems of your body and mind affect you very strongly. Well, all of that goes away, leading us to a very important point we've made here several times. Vedanta doesn't give you anything. Vedanta takes away. Vedanta takes away, it removes suffering by removing the cause for suffering, which is ignorance. Okay, let's continue. Alupta twatmano drishtir, alupta twatmano drishtir, notpadya kara kara yataha, notpadya kara kara yataha, drishyaya chanyaya drishtya, drishyaya chanyaya drishtya, janyatasya prakalpita, janyatasya prakalpita. More references to Brihadaranyaka, alupta, that alupta drik, you might remember, the seer that continues to see without interruption. The unblinking seer, so to speak. And that alupta, uninterrupted, unceasing, that's a good translation. Unceasing drishtihi means consciousness. Alupta drishtihi is unceasing consciousness. Whose consciousness? Atmanaha. The consciousness which is your true nature is alupta. Unceasing. And the word hidden here is tu. Tu atma becomes twatma. Tu means but, creating a contrast with the prior half that said jnana vritti, the particular mental event that makes you enlightened, comes and goes. Tu, on the other hand, drishtihi, consciousness, is alupta, unceasing, doesn't come and go. Why? Na utpadya, because that consciousness is not created. Anything created has a beginning. Anything that has a beginning has an end. Anything put together, my guru liked to quote this, I don't know why. He kept saying, anything put together out of parts falls apart. He liked that. Anything put together, made of parts, falls apart. Consciousness is not created. Utpadya, it's not made of parts. Yataha karakaihi. So that consciousness is not utpadya. That na utpadya forms no padya. Consciousness is not produced karakaihi by various factors associated with action. We'll discuss that actually in the coming verse. So consciousness doesn't originate. Knower originates. Remember the question? The status of being a knower, or we could even use a Sanskrit word here, jnata, or even sakshi, comes and goes, has an origination. There's a knower only when there's a mind and an object. There's sakshi only when there's a mind. Don't need an object. But mind comes and goes, objects come and go. So knower, jnata, and sakshi are impermanent, whereas consciousness is alupta. But the problem comes, Shankara points to in the second half, he says that in the middle of the last line, hidden there is asyaha, of it. Of what? Of that drishti. Drishti literally means seeing, but in this context it means consciousness. So asyaha, of that consciousness, janyata, the state of being created, the origination of consciousness, prakalpita, is imagined. Consciousness is imagined to have an origination. Imagined by whom? That's always an interesting question. Who is doing all of this stuff? Who has this ignorance? Who or what is it that is affected by ignorance and who causes all this suffering in life? And Shankara uses some very interesting language here. He says, all the problems are caused by anyaya, by someone else. That's how typical. It's never my problem, it's somebody else did it. The problem is caused by something else which is drishyaya, something else which is seen. Something else which is seen, but which is drishtya. Drishti is seeing. Now, I don't know if you can appreciate the play on words here. Drishya and drishti. Drishya is what is seen. Drishti is seer. And Shankara is actually equating the two here. It's very peculiar. It's a play on words. The seer which is seen, the knower which is known. Remember we started off with the knower that's not known? Now we've got the opposite case. The knower that is known. Can you guess what that would be? The knower that is known? The one who says, I know. Ahankara. The knower who is known is that mental condition we call ahankara, ego. The ego says, I know. Occasionally the ego says, I don't know. If that ego has some humility, I don't know. But too many times, I know. Anyway, here, the seer which is seen, the knower which is known, ego. So due to that ego, the ego is the one who says that consciousness has an origin. Because to the ego, there is an origin. And that's going to be, I'm going to wait a couple of verses for that. Okay. When you wake up, don't you feel like it's like the light bulb was, when you wake up from deep sleep, it's as though the light bulb was turned on. Somebody turned on a switch. I'm awake now. I'm conscious. My consciousness has returned. As we know, it doesn't work that way. Obviously, there's no switch, but more than that, as we've discussed at great length, consciousness doesn't go away when you sleep. But you misinterpret the experience of sleep by attributing to consciousness impermanence, right? This is a misinterpretation of your experience of sleep. When you wake up, it's not that consciousness turns back on, but that your ego re-emerges. Here I am. I'm awake. Is that consciousness speaking or is that ego speaking? It's the ego that wakes up, not consciousness. Consciousness remains without change, alupta, Sri Shankara says. Consciousness is unblinking, unceasing. So what wakes up in the morning is ego. And the ego, having woken up, makes a wrong conclusion. What is a wrong conclusion? Consciousness has returned. Not that consciousness has returned. Ego re-emerged and caused this wrong conclusion, and that wrong conclusion is what Shankara describes in the second half of this verse. Okay, next. Dehatma buddhyapekshatvad, dehatma buddhyapekshatvad, atmana kartrita mrisha, atmana kartrita mrisha, naiva kinchit karomiti, naiva kinchit karomiti, satya buddhi pramanaja, satya buddhi pramanaja. In the second line, atmanaha kartrita. Kartrita, the state of being a doer, an agent of action, the sense of agency, atmanaha, belonging to Atma, the sense that I did it. Sri Shankara says very clearly, mrisha, it's wrong. It is a wrong interpretation of your experience. It's when you say, I did it, consciousness is not speaking. Ahankara is speaking. Therefore, that sense of agency, kartata, does not belong to Atma, it belongs to ahankara, correct? You get it? But it is falsely attributed. The sense of being an agent of action, I did it, is falsely attributed to Atma. Why? First line, deha atma buddhi apekshatvat, because of its dependence on dehatma buddhi. This is a term that's used often, and you should know the meaning of it. Here, buddhi means conclusion. Dehatma, deha, body, atma, self. Deha equals atma, that conclusion. The conclusion that I am the body is called in Sanskrit dehatma buddhi, means I am the body. This wrong conclusion is at the root of all suffering. And this wrong conclusion is due to the failure to discern your true nature as pure consciousness, and that's where we get in trouble. On the other hand, the second half, he says, naiva kinchit karomiti, I don't do anything at all, quoting from Bhagavad Gita. So prior, first half said, I did it. Second half says, I don't do anything at all. That is an accurate reference to Atma, consciousness. So this he calls satya buddhi. This is the correct conclusion. Earlier was mrisha, the wrong conclusion, and here we have satya vidya buddhihi, the correct conclusion. And the correct conclusion in the interpretation of your experience. Again, one more verse, and I want to talk about that quite a bit. So this correct conclusion is born not of experience, but it is pramanaja. This correct conclusion comes from a pramana, a proper source of knowledge, which in this case is our scriptures. So the scriptures lead you to the correct conclusion that your true nature is consciousness. Since consciousness is unchanging, consciousness can't do anything. I remember I quoted my guru as saying consciousness is good for nothing. Can't do anything. Good for nothing. So, consciousness, that na karomi iti, reflects the perspective of that consciousness. And this knowledge comes to us from Scripture. Our own experience only reinforces the wrong conclusion. I'm teaching, I'm talking, I'm raising my hand. So experience very easily leads us to a wrong conclusion. We need to correctly interpret our experiences, and therefore we use scriptures, including Sri Shankara's teachings. Then, this one, two, way again. Here we go. Okay. Kartritvam karakapeksham, kartritvam karakapeksham, akartritvam swabhavataha, akartritvam swabhavataha, karta bhokteti vijnanam, karta bhokteti vijnanam, mrishayveti sunishchitam, mrishayveti sunishchitam. Kartritvam, the sense of being a doer, an agent of action, that sense I did it. And Shankara says here that sense of I did it depends, karaka apeksham, depends on karaka, these factors involved in knowledge. Many of you were in yesterday's Bhagavad Gita class. We had those 5 karaka, the 5 factors involved in action. The adhishtanam, the body, the karta, the agent of action, karana, instruments, and cheshta, action, and daiva. We won't get into all those details. We had that discussion in yesterday's Bhagavad Gita class. In the presence of all those factors, I did it. But that I did it is only present in the presence of those factors. In particular, that karta, the second of the 5 factors we discussed in yesterday's class. And remember, in yesterday's class, I identified karta, agent of action, as being ego. In the absence of ego, we just discussed, you can't do anything. That's what Shankara is saying here. Kartritvam, the sense of being an agent, is karaka apeksham. It depends on these factors. In particular, it depends on the presence of the ego. But now Shankara is going to make a very important point. The ego is not your essential nature. The ego is a mental event that says, I am, that feeling of individuality which comes and goes every night in deep sleep. It goes away. Right now it's present. So Shankara makes a distinction here. The ego, which is the locus of that sense of agency, the ego which says, I did it, is an extraneous factor. It's not an essential truth of who you are. On the other hand, akartritvam, The absence of that sense of agency is swabhavataha. It is your own true nature. The sense of agency is only present when the ego is present. But unchanging consciousness is always present because it's your true nature. Notice the sense of being an agent comes and goes, as it does in deep sleep. Consciousness doesn't come and go, even in deep sleep. So this is what shows your true nature as being consciousness independent of that agent. Karta bhokta iti vijnanam. The vijnanam here again means conclusion. The conclusion that karta, I am an agent of action. Bhokta, I am an experiencer. I do things and I experience things. Those conclusions, Sri Shankara says, mrisha eva, are false. Absolutely false. Mrisha eva. Iti sunishchitam. Thus it is well understood, that is properly understood. Now's the time. Here's my comment here. This conclusion, I did it, and I'm experiencing whatever is happening right now, those are very common conclusions based on what we're experiencing right now. Right now I'm teaching. So there's the experience of the act of teaching, which could lead to the wrong conclusion, I did it, I'm teaching. Right now I have the experience of everything happening in the room, which could lead me to the wrong conclusion, I am the experiencer, bhokta. The point is, and this is something I hinted at earlier, we're going to see in a little more detail now, is these wrong conclusions are based on the wrong interpretation of our ordinary experience. It's kind of ironic that something so ordinary is subject to misinterpretation. But that happens to be the fact. How many times have you heard me give the sunset example? That's pretty ordinary, the sun going down. But then if you conclude the sun is going down, you've misinterpreted your experience. So the point here is that which is an ordinary event is most certainly subject to misinterpretation. The sun doesn't go down. The horizon is moving up. In the same way, your experience right now, this moment, is equally subject to misinterpretation. That's the point. And in a very odd way, all of Vedanta could be said to be an inquiry into this ordinary experience we're having right now and to find out how we've misunderstood it. And we've misunderstood it due to identification with the body and mind and everything else that we've just discussed. So how then do we properly interpret this ordinary experience we're having right now? And that's what Shankara describes in the next verse. Evam shastranumanabhyam Evam shastranumanabhyam Swarupe vagate sati Swarupe vagate sati Niyojyo hamati hyesha Niyojyo hamati hyesha Satya buddhi katam bhavet Satya buddhi katam bhavet. Evam, thus, Shastra, Anumana, and that's a dual ending, Bhyam, through Shastra, scripture, and Anumana, reasoning, through scripture and reasoning, we properly interpret this ordinary experience. Experience has to be interpreted, right? And has to be properly interpreted. The sun doesn't go down, never has gone down. The horizon moves up. But in order to make that correct interpretation about the sunset, you need some instruction. There is a shastra for that. It's called astronomy books. And there is anumana, reasoning for that. So through reasoning and scientific knowledge, you understand that you've been misinterpreting your experience of the sunset for an awfully long time now. But with the help of scientific knowledge and with the help of reasoning, you can properly interpret your experience of the sunset in the same way. This experience we're having right now is grossly misinterpreted. You think you're listening to me. You think you're understanding me. That's the misinterpretation. You are the pure consciousness in which all these activities are taking place, but that pure consciousness is not in and of itself engaged in those activities. Your body is engaged, your ears are engaged, your mind is engaged. Everything is engaged except consciousness. Good for nothing, right? like my guru said. So to discover yourself to be consciousness which is not engaged, and that not engaged is crucial. The Sanskrit word we would use is asanga. Asanga. Asanga, not literally not connected, not attached, but not engaged is a really nice meaning right now. That's crucial because the only way you're going to become free from suffering is through detachment, giving up that wrong identification, false identification with your body and mind. As we said before, as long as that identification continues, you will suffer. It's guaranteed. So therefore, we need to disentangle ourselves. That's an appropriate word here. We need to disentangle ourselves from the body and mind and recognize ourselves. How? Sri Shankara says, swarupe avagate sati. He says, when your swarupa, when your true nature as unchanging consciousness, when that true nature avagate sati, when your true nature is recognized. When your true nature is recognized. How? Through Shastra, scripture, and Anumana, reasoning, through which we can come to properly understand the experience we're having right now. This is enlightenment. The proper discernment of your true nature as unchanging consciousness, which is not engaged in what's happening right now. Or, if you want to say, engaged only to the extent of revealing this experience, making this experience known. We could say that consciousness is this is a metaphor, consciousness is the fabric of experience. Whatever is painted on the fabric is external. Consciousness is the fabric. Okay, fabric of experience. Now, Shankara ends this verse with his pet peeve. You know that Shankara has a pet peeve? And his pet peeve is all these people who are stuck doing rituals. The people who say you have to do the rituals to get enlightened. So Shankara points out here that when you really get it, that your consciousness is not engaged in these rituals anyway, then he says niyojyaha ahameti esha buddhihi. The conclusion that I am aham, I am niyojyaha. I am enjoined by scripture to do these rituals. Shankara says that conclusion, katham satya bhaved. How could you make that? How could you conclude that to be correct? How could you be such a blockhead to imagine that you have to do rituals if you really understand you are unchanging consciousness, which is not engaged in the performance of rituals, nor is it the recipient of the fruits of those rituals. Remember, body, mind, senses, all of that is engaged in the deed of performing rituals. The karmas accrue to that doer of action, not to consciousness. Okay, leading us to the final verse of this chapter. Yatha sarvantaram vyoma, yatha sarvantaram vyoma, vyomnopyabhyantaro hyaham, vyomnopyabhyantaram hyaham, nirvikaro chala shuddho, nirvikaro chala shuddho, jaro mukta sadadvayaha, jaro mukta sadadvayaha. So Shankara ends with a nice metaphor. Yatha, just as vyoma, space. Vyoma, space is sarva antaram. Space is inside everything. Remember in a prior chapter, I don't know how many chapters ago, we had that interesting argument, which I haven't seen anywhere else. It was an argument based on degrees of subtleness. Do you remember that? It was a little obscure, I admit it was a little obscure, but it was an argument based on degrees of subtleness. Whatever is more subtle is more pervasive. Whatever is more subtle is more pervasive was the essence of that discussion. Some time ago we had it. So look at this. Space is more subtle than this chair. This chair is very perceptible. That perceptible is the opposite of subtle. The chair is gross, as we say. Gross in a sense of it has physicality. So because space is more subtle than the chair, therefore space is more pervasive than the chair. The chair is sitting here. Space is inside the chair. Space is outside the chair. So space, being more subtle than the chair, is more pervasive than a chair. That's the first line. Just as vyoma, space, is sarva antaram. It is within everything, being more pervasive than the physical world. And in the same way, the Shankara says, first line is the drishtanta, second line is the darshtanta. Just as space is more subtle than anything else in the world, in the same way, at the end of the second line, he, aham, he, indeed, aham, I am abhyantaraha, I am inside vyomnaha api, even space. A little subtle. First line, just as space is inside everything, in the same way, I am inside space. I'm being very literal, so you get the structure here. Just like space is inside everything, I am inside space. Going back to the what we've talked about, levels of subtleness. Just as space is more subtle than everything, I am more subtle than space. Space pervades everything. Consciousness pervades space. In a sense that space is in consciousness. You're aware of space. You can understand space. You can sense, you can comprehend what is space. So your consciousness can apprehend even space, showing that your consciousness is the most subtle. And then Shankara concludes the chapter with these final words, that aham at the end of the second line, aham, I, my true nature, is nirvikaraha, unchanging. Philosophers like the word immutable. It sounds a little fancy. It simply means unchanging. My true nature as consciousness is nirvikaraha. It is unchanging. It is achalaha, unmoving. Remember, it's not that consciousness travels at death. Sukshma sharira travels at death. What happens to consciousness at death? Same thing that happens to consciousness in deep sleep. Nothing. So that consciousness is achalaha, that consciousness is shuddhaha, pure meaning utterly unaffected by the problems of your body and mind, just like the sun is unaffected by what it shines upon. In the same way, when your consciousness illumines happiness and sadness in your mind, your consciousness is not affected by the happiness or sadness. Consciousness is ajaraha. It doesn't have old age. Doesn't have a birthday. Your body has a birthday. Consciousness has no birthday. And finally, two more. You see, sada, always. Sada muktaha, eternally free. Never got into this world of samsara in the first place. Never was affected by any of this. And that consciousness is advayaha, non-dual. How consciousness is non-dual is a huge topic. We're not going to get into it here at the end of the class. We've discussed it before, and we'll leave the chapter here. So that brings chapter 12 to an end, and next week we'll continue with chapter 13. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om. That's it.